Hello, I'm Sylvia Usher, the Secretary of the Historical Branch in Hull and the East Riding. This is a very special welcome to a wide range of people I know are joining this webinar. Historical Association members, friends, and I think it covers quite a wide area of the country. So this is special that you're here. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this event being organised through WISE, the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation, which is a particularly acclaimed part of the history department at Hull University. And the subject this evening, the question of the evidence of slavery connections with Hull throughout the 17th, 18th and 19th century, is a really important point for us to be asking questions about. However much we appreciate Wilberforce's work, that was only a small section. So I hope you're going to find this very challenging and very interesting. In organising and supporting this webinar, we're joined by Wilberforce House Museum, and I do like to recommend a marvellous place to visit, to the Hull Freedom Festival, the Hull Afro-Caribbean Association, and the 10 Tribes of Yorkshire. So I hope that indicates the wide range of interest. Our two leaders of the webinar are Professor Trevor Burnard, who is now the director of WISE. Trevor came to this job as an acclaimed historical researcher and scholar for the history of the Caribbean. And I think we ought to remind ourselves that Britain was the dominant colonial power in the Caribbean. He has a particularly noted book, Jamaica in the Age of Revolution. And when you visit Wilberforce House, I think you'll note and listen to part of the, frankly, very disturbing diary of the plantation and slave owner, Thomas Thistlewood. And it's Trevor's work which revealed that type of information of an example of the very brutal slave owner. Dr. Nicholas Evans, known to a good number of us in Hull because of the work he's done in many areas, is the senior lecturer in diaspora history at the history department. And this has covered very significant migrations, both to Britain and then on to other countries in North America, as well as people who left Britain. Particularly, they were people from religious and ethnic minorities. So a study of those who have suffered and been persecuted. So we're very fortunate in this. We'll watch the webinar, and then at the end, there's a time for questions. And you've got a small button at the right-hand side where you can type in and send your question. We're not doing a situation of people, pressing a hand button or raising a hand, because unfortunately, I think we've got quite a large number of people and it would be difficult. But please don't hesitate to ask questions. This is new and interesting for us all. So at this point, I'm delighted we're going to have so much guidance and understanding from Trevor and Nicholas. Thank you.
Good evening. For those who know me, welcome back. For those who haven't heard me before, then good luck. I'm Nick Evans, or Nicholas as my Sunday name shows here. And tonight it's a double presentation by myself and my colleague Trevor. Unusually for me, I've got a script, so apologies for reading, but this is new research, so we very much welcome any views or any comments you've got. And there were no daft questions tonight. We want you to have an active support from our audience, but also some heckling too. Okay. Since the 1980s, pupils in England have largely been taught the complex history of Atlantic slavery through the experience of the enslaved in the United States. After independence from Britain, the brutalized legacy of slavery, especially racism, continues to scar the descendants living in that country to this day. Eschewing the broader scientific analysis by historians like Trevor and others of the forced trafficking of 12 million men, women and children from Africa, and completely ignoring the life-limiting forced labour that enslaved Africans toiled in the broader regions in the Americas, like the Caribbean and Latin America. The legacy of this pedagogical concentration of teaching upon American-centred learning is problematic, especially here in post-colonial Britain. Despite numerous scholars and teachers, including, and we're privileged to be hosted tonight by one of these groups, the Historical Association, despite their work championing a revision to such pedagogy, teaching has largely remained unchanged, suiting Britain's interest, we would argue, to showcase slavery to children as a foreign affair. Where Britain's slavery past is mentioned in curriculum, it has largely been the story of moral righteousness, of how Britain abolished the slave trade and later ended slavery, decades ahead of other European and American nations. Such distilling of a contentious and complex issue is unsurprising. It suits Britain's interests. The history has a usable past. Yet, as we've seen during the last momentous year, it has ramifications far beyond the classroom, as most people now feel ill-equipped to fully engage with some of the debates about heritage that we witnessed on both sides of the Atlantic during the past 12 or so months. Equipped by increasingly accessible digital resources, especially the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database launched by Friends at University College London in 2012, and earlier data sets such as the Slave Voyages database co-produced by our founding director, Professor David Richardson, that was launched in 2009, which I'd recommend you have a look at online. Communities far beyond the academy and the schoolroom have now increasingly begun to retake control of the decolonisation of Britain's slavery past. Empowered by digital heritage, they can contest stories often retold in public spaces, whether they are museums, country houses, heritage installations, statues, or even the media. Society at large is for the first time seriously questioning the interpretation of Britain's imperial past, and especially its slavery past, by early scholars such as Reginald Coupland and his followers. Events like Black Lives Matter in 2020 challenged many communities to question their historic environments and their involvement in slavery, and to challenge civic interpretation of the past, often told to residents and visitors alike through heritage. Yet while so much energy has been rightly fixated on the former slaving ports of Bristol, Liverpool, London, Glasgow and Lancaster, discussions here in Hull, in God's own county, have held up Wilberforce as a totem for the city's past. We don't have an involvement with these discussions because our hero, our man remembered in a statue for slavery, he was an anti-slavery hero. The scholars of slavery and diaspora, Trevor and I feel it is time for the city to begin a mature conversation about the city's past and the role of its citizens at home and abroad during this period of slavery. The sons and daughters of the town, later city of Kingston upon Hull, and its hinterland did many fine things, and we shouldn't ignore those. They championed the political campaign for the abolition of the slave trade. They supported fledgling post-slave societies in Sierra Leone, where we retain a very strong link with to this day. And we even raised funds for the education of children in societies that had ended slavery, such as the British Cape. We even created the world's first slavery museum to tell this story in 1906, and even in 2007 established an arts festival to spread the anti-slavery message today. Yet what's not been asked, what's not been discussed is, was the city involved in slave trade or slavery? If so, what did this comprise? And how do we reconcile this uncomfortable aspect of our past? Here tonight, we don't propose all the answers, nor present all the research, all the finished research, but this is just the beginning of a conversation, not the reiteration of earlier agreed or earlier published conclusions. But we feel in the aftermath of global movements like Black Lives Matter and broader campaigns to decolonise higher education, where, as Sylvia has just mentioned, future generations of history teachers are trained, we feel it's right that we begin to try and balance such debates during the questions at the end. We would love to hear your views on this ongoing work because, like the campaign to abolish slavery, it remains unfinished business. I'd now like to hand over to my learned colleague, Trevor.
Thank you very much, Nick. I start off with a little vignette. On 17th of November, 1752, Thomas Thistlewood from Lincolnshire, an overseer on Egypt Estate in Westmoreland Parish in Jamaica, was very excited in his diaries. It was very excited. In his diaries for that day, in his diaries, which are noted here on the PowerPoint, diaries that are one of the major sources we have about the brutality of life in Jamaica, he exclaimed that while he was riding home, he overtook a white young woman riding to Jacob Allen's. The young lady, later revealed as Diana Jones, had come to Jamaica as one of the last female indentured servants to come from England to the island. And she told Thistlewood that she'd been born at Hull, had been brought up at Louth, and knows Bucknell very well, having been several times at Mr. Dobbs, knows my brother. This was the second time in less than 4 months that Thistlewood had met someone in Western Jamaica who was from Hull. In early July, he had dined with a merchant from a ship that was from Hull, along with the captain, a man named Captain Fullerton, whom the other merchant, James Atkinson, said was a man of poor character. Thistlewood was much more excited about seeing Diana Jones than about seeing Captain Fullerton, because Diana Jones had come over with him on the Flying Farnborough in 1750, and thus was his shipmate. A year later, in 1753, he visited Diana, now married to Thomas A. Adams, and with a baby. He gave Diana a pair of grey ducks for a present. It might not have had the effect that Thistlewood intended. It seems to have provoked a quarrel. Thomas Adams quarrelled with Diana, and she fled rather upset into the bush. Well, that's the last we hear of Diana Jones and Thistlewood's very lengthy diaries, though not of Thomas Adams. And it might say something, I guess, about the relatively limited presence of Hull in Jamaica in that extreme slave society. People from Yorkshire did not often go to Jamaica. Of the 86% of migrants who migrated to Jamaica between 1670 and 1750 who came from England, just 4.5% came from the north, perhaps 2.5–3% came from Yorkshire. Thus, by a matter of extrapolation, hardly anybody would have come from the East Riding, and even fewer than that from Hull. Diana Jones may have been one of the few people from Hull ever to go to Jamaica. But from Thistlewood's evidence, obviously some ships from Hull arrived in Jamaica. The Flying Farnborough, for example, was named after the East Riding town. Hull's involvement in the slave trade, however, was minimal. The authoritative transatlantic slave trade database that Nick mentioned, that my predecessor, David Richardson of the Wilberforce Institute, helped create, shows that only one ship, I think there might be two, but only one I could find, had been built in Hull, a ship called the Tartar, which went to Jamaica carrying enslaved people, 254. I think there might have been another ship which went to St. Kitts. And there was not a single ship that left from Hull as part of the transatlantic slave trade. So one built in Hull, but none going from Hull as part of that trade. Well, Nick will provide much more detail on Hull's connections to slavery than I'm able to do. As should be apparent from my accent, which is a sort of a New Zealand, Australian, English, American mix, as it should be apparent, I'm not from around these parts, and my knowledge of Hull is pretty limited, derived mostly from secondary accounts. What I do want to do in these comments, before I turn over to the substance of the talk today from Nick, is to talk about the wider context, one in which Hull in the 18th century was very much part of a global Britain, with a developing and growing empire, which in the 18th century was firmly connected to various forms of Atlantic slavery. There are two things about Hull's history, and I think about the Britain's links with slavery in the 18th century, which I'd like to stress. The first is that Hull looked outwards as much as inwards, and it was always a global city, as Nick tells us in his marvellous chapter in a book on Hull's history and culture, developed the City of Culture year of 2017. The multicultural reality of Hull over several centuries and its role, particularly in the 19th century, as a major centre of foreign diasporas, and its long history of commerce being underpinned by foreigners is clear from Nick's work. It does sometimes seem to be forgotten in recent accounts of Hull, which at least to an outsider like myself can be very myopic. I was certainly struck by a recent publication from our City Council, which talks about Hull's economic future, not mentioning anything about global commercial and financial and migration patterns, and identified the two major threats to its strategy as being national and international economic growth and trading opportunities, and international migration and investment. Those were strengths in Hull's past, if they might be threats today. The second point I want to make is that even if Hull's direct involvement with slavery was small, certainly compared to the great Atlantic ports of Liverpool and Bristol and the cotton metropolis of Manchester, the importance of slavery in the American and West Indian plantation colonies was so great in the 18th century that Hull could not help but be affected by what was going on in the larger world, a world in which Britain and Ireland were closely imbricated in an Atlantic world with a dynamic plantation sector based firmly upon the brutal exploitation of Africans in African chattel slavery. And it's important to make that point, to make clear that the efforts of William Wilberforce, the next slide, Nick, if I can, Hannah Thornton, David Hartley, and other abolitionists in the area to attack the slave trade and slavery are all the more commendable in a nation firmly committed to slavery, with crucial interests supporting that institution arrayed against abolition. So one of the things I really don't want to do tonight is to say anything against the person after whom my professorship is named, because what Wilberforce did, as Eric Williams, who's featured beside here, acknowledged, even though he was not a great fan of William Wilberforce, he much preferred Thomas Clarkson. But what William Wilberforce did from his birth in 1759 until his death in 1833 was to really challenge something which was absolutely central to British life. And if we are to understand what Wilberforce was up against, if we are to understand the magnitude of his achievement in forcing onto the political table an issue that caused people immense discomfort, we need to appreciate just how total the support for slavery was in Britain when he was born in 1759. And that's something that Eric Williams, the great Trinidadian Prime Minister and historian, made clear in his great book from 1944 called Capitalism and Slavery. He was not a great fan of abolitionists, but he recognized just how important abolitionists had been in changing the mood in Britain. He noted that prior to 1783, in other words, prior to Wilberforce's evangelical conversion to anti-slavery, he noted that prior to 1783, all classes in English society presented a united front with regard to the slave trade. The monarchy, the government, the church, public opinion in general supported the slave trade. There were few protests, and these were ineffective. And we can see how strongly the slave trade and slavery was supported by the attitudes by people at all levels in Britain, not least in the royal family. It's often forgotten just how much the royal family was in support of slavery. The Royal African Company was founded by Charles II, was governed by James II in that period, and was supported by all monarchs in the 18th and 19th century. The most important of whom, I guess, was William IV, who, as Duke of Clarence, was the leading representative of the pro-slavery interest in Parliament. It's really noticeable that the Royal African Company, which was the institution devised to bring over enslaved Africans to the Americas, was prefixed by the name Royal, like the Royal Post Office or the Royal Navy. And I want to emphasize that because one of the things I think it's really important to emphasize is that slavery was something which was supported by all sorts of people in the country. In the same way we support the Royal Navy and the Royal Post Office, the Royal African Company was something which had the primature of the royal family, and thus was considered a very good thing for British society. So what Wilberforce did going against that was quite remarkable. To continue with what Williams was saying, he says, the West Indian Islands became the hub of the British Empire, of immense importance to the grandeur and prosperity of England. It was a Negro slaves, used Negro in 1944. It was the Negro slaves who made these sugar colonies the most precious colonies ever recorded in the whole annals of imperialism. The British Empire, Macaulay Postlethwaite, now there's a great name for you. The British Empire, Macaulay Postlethwaite declared, was a magnificent superstructure of American commerce and naval power on an African foundation. And we need to remember just how immense the profits from slavery and especially sugar were. Sugar moving in the 18th century from being a luxury product to the sort of product that even a housewife in the outer islands of Scotland would feel that she needed to have in order to serve to her guests with that other imperial product, a cup of tea. The trade to Americas and the West Indies was massive. To Jamaica alone, Britain sent nearly 500,000 pounds of exports and imported 1.2 million pounds per annum between 1752 and 1769. In 1798, the Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, Wilberforce's great friend, assessed the income to Britain from the West Indies at £4 million per annum, compared to 1 million from the rest of the world. The slave trade and slavery was big business. Now, of course, what we have to know is how big was big. How big was the plantation trade for the British economy? We can look at it in all sorts of ways, but probably in expansive ways is the best way to do it. The slave trade itself, relatively small, not growing a great deal, was something that in 1807 caused economic problems to only a small number of people. But the trade to the plantations was much greater in general. And recent estimates that the percentage of gross domestic product made up of plantation agriculture to America and the West Indies increased over time from 3.5% of British GDP between 1700 and 1710 to 11% between 1800 and 1810. The figure I've got here, though, is 6%, which is if we exclude, as we should do, trade, which is just the colonial and American goods trade. To put that into context, what would you say that would be today? It would probably be something similar, say, for example, to the computer industry or the mobile phone industry. So getting rid of slavery would be equivalent today of getting rid of computers or getting rid of mobile phones in terms of economic impact for the country, or getting rid of a substantial portion of clothing and fashion, areas where we have the same issues today as people in the 18th century fond of sugar had if we want to be free of the system of slavery. One of the things I think that's important to mention is that we shouldn't blame our ancestors too much. We have as much problems today in getting ourselves free from modern slavery as people in the past did from slavery and all its things in the 18th century, because it was such a big trade and so important in so many areas of British commerce. What we need to keep in mind, looking at the importance of slavery to 18th century Britain, is just how valuable its American colonies were. And I've listed there a whole lot of figures there. But the major thing to keep in mind, I guess, is that the wealth of the American colonies was 5 times as much as the wealth of Scotland, 10 times as much as the wealth of Ireland, probably about 60% of the wealth of England and Wales. In other words, it was a very big sector. And places like Kingston, which were Kingston upon Hull, were very small places. Not much different in 1772 in its population from the population of its namesake, Kingston in Jamaica, which had 14,200 people in that area. Now, it's important that, as far as I'm aware, relatively few people in Hull were directly involved in slavery. So very few people in Hull owned enslaved people and were slave owners. There were, however, some exceptions, and indeed, though the numbers of people owning enslaved people in Hull and the East Riding were small, those that were there were large slave owners, and I've listed 3 there in important. Simon Taylor, the heir of the richest man in the British Empire, namesake Simon Taylor, 1740 to 1813, who owned it in 1834 when emancipation occurred, and when Britain gave £20 million in compensation to slave owners, owned over 1,000 enslaved people, and he got £20,000 in compensation. He also got 4 years of free labour from the enslaved people that he owned, because the slaves were freed in 1834, but were not fully freed until 1838. They worked for no pay between 1834 and 1838. So probably you could double the amount that Simon Taylor got. What does that mean in terms of what he could, in terms of what that meant for money in that period? Well, estimates suggest that if you had 40,000, if you had 40,000 pounds, you could buy something like 4,000 horses, or you could buy something like 1,000 people, employ 1,000 people for a year. So it's a very substantial amount of money. The other two people in the areas, all of whom came from Beverley, Simon Taylor owning Eton Hall, was Stephen Denton owning Beverley Park, and Richard Watt III owning Bishop Burton. I listed those there. Next slide if it's possible, Nick. And here we have Eton Hall and Bishop Burton Hall as two places which are important. I'll say a little bit about Bishop Burton Hall, because I think that's one perhaps is the place that has the most resonance today. Richard Watt III was in the 19th century when you got slave compensation. He had owned 296 enslaved people in Jamaica, and he owned the marvellous Bishop Burton Hall and also Speke Hall. He was a great Yorkshire sportsman, living between 1786 and 1855, educated at Eton and Oxford, heavily involved in the Beverley races, and was most famous for winning the St Leger with a horse called Altisidora, which is the name of a pub in the East Riding after that great victory. He never went to Jamaica, but he made most of his money from his Jamaican property and left a fortune perhaps of over £100,000 at his death. In records, it was claimed that he got this fortune from a relative who was a tanner, but that rather stretches credulity. Most came from his father and great uncle, who'd moved to Jamaica in the 1750s, the same time as Thistlewood had done, but had become much richer than Thistlewood had managed to do. His hall, Bishop Burton Hall, of course, is now Bishop Burton College, a further and higher education establishment, mainly offering agricultural courses. I'm not quite sure to what extent they acknowledge the slave-owning past, but I didn't note it on his website that it had any acknowledgement of that. Richard Watt III died aged 78 in 1855. And this is where things, we need to talk about the complexities of the past, because in many ways he was a very decent man. He'd been a considerable philanthropist, very generous to the people of Hull, well loved in his region as a good squire, somewhere where with good connections with Hull. His wife came from Hull, and he'd be married at Holy Trinity. He was active in the militia. He was High Sheriff of Yorkshire, and he gave money to the debtors in Hull jail. So that shows you some of the direct influences. As far as I know, and perhaps the next slide, if there's one, Nick, I can't remember if there is. Hull was far from being. No, I'll go back to the previous one. Hull was far from being a major centre of slavery in the 18th and 19th century. As far as I know, none of the major merchant families, the Thorntons, the Sykes, the Wilberforces, had direct connections with the slave trade. Though some of these had connections with sugar refineries, and sugar refineries were particularly notable as beneficiaries of slavery. Hull was, as we well know, more an anti-slavery than a slavery town. And it's not just William Wilberforce, but David Hartley, MP in 1766, from Hull, was the first MP to start the struggle to end slavery. So there's much in which Hull has to be very, very proud. The emancipation of slaves was popular and heartfelt in Hull, as we well know. Nevertheless, the influence of slavery on the plantation colonies was so great in the 18th century that it was hard to avoid being involved indirectly, if not directly, in slavery. And that's one of the things that historians have been doing in the last recent time, is just to show how that great wealth of America and the West Indies meant that so many British industries grew from supplying the plantations. And we can see that in a number of ways. Our Nuala Zahidia, who is a fellow at the Wilberforce Institute, previously professor of history at the University of Edinburgh, has written brilliantly on the copper trade, an industry which you would not think automatically to be involved with slavery, but which provided large amounts of copper material to slave plantations. Chris Evans in South Wales has talked about how the iron industry, particularly in the northeast, and of course we had iron industry in Hull as well, was particularly important. A good deal of iron, and we might say timber as well. Timber from the Baltic went across to slave plantations in America, and perhaps especially to the West Indies. Woolens also were important. And one of the things that Chris has done is to show how even poor people in mid Wales, a place you would never think have much connections with slavery, were directly involved in the slave system through providing woolens for slaves. When emancipation occurred, that market dried up, and those woolen workers moved to become miners in the South Wales villages. So I'm going to turn over to Nick in a moment, but one of the things, just to leave you with a couple of things, I think, at the moment. The first thing that I'd like to say is that Hull was, of course, involved in some ways, not great number of ways, but in some ways with slavery, occasionally directly, but more often indirectly. And the second thing I want to say is that slavery was so important within the economy of Britain in the 18th century, particularly before the abolitionist movement started in the 1780s, led in particular by people like William Wilberforce, that it was integral to so many features of that dynamic and growing 18th century society and economy. So over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Trevor. Okay, so just to the slide. Okay. So given the London-centric nature of British history or British historiography, it's unsurprising that Hull's links with the slave trade, with slavery, have largely been ignored. Indeed, Hull's position in the annals of British, or the historiography of anti-slavery in Britain, remains very much focused on William Wilberforce, even ignoring David Hartley, we've just heard about. It's inconceivable, as Trevor has just demonstrated, that part of Yorkshire did not have a link to either the slave trade or slavery beyond the work of the Lassalls. And yet, as visitors to the Caribbean island of Barbados know, they're immediately reminded that there are links to Yorkshire which stretch back to the beginning of the colonisation of the island, rather than later involvement of the Lassalls, who settled at Leeds, at Harwood House. Local connections closer to Hull include the owners of the magnificent Castle Howard estate, 40 miles northwest of the city, which was the seat of the Earls of Carlisle, who played a central role in the colonising of Britain's first sugar island, Barbados. The island was built, and the fortunes of their planters were built on the proceeds of the development and cultivation of sugar. Today, if you visit Carlisle Bay, the most prominent bay near Bridgetown, its capital city, was named after the Earls of Carlisle. And yet, it was not the only connection to the region, and these connections get a lot more closer than Castle Howard. Carlisle's counterpart, fellow Jacobean early planter from Anlaby, Robert Legard, from Anlaby, 4 miles west of Hull, was a relative of Howard through marriage. He was a royalist and supporter during the English Civil War, having arrived in the 1820s, and was even given a knighthood by Charles II later on because of his loyalty during the English Civil War to the Crown. He acquired an estate called Four Hills, just north of Speightstown on the west coast of Barbados. And through a combination of loyal service in defending the island and through his economic involvement as a member of the plantocracy, this lad from Anlaby was raised to the gentry under the post-Restoration government of Charles II. Whilst Leigard's ancestral home at Anlaby, shown in the top left, was blown up by a loyalist in the aftermath of Charles I's unsuccessful siege of Hull in the 1640s, it's likely that the house we see today, shown in this slide, was rebuilt on the proceeds of slavery that the Leigards remitted to England in the 1660s and 1670s. Evidence at the Treasure House in Beverley details very precisely how the family maintained ownership of 24 named enslaved Africans. And they were named because they were bequeathed as property or chattels in wills or given as marriage dowries. Slavery thus enabled lads from Hull to marry into other members of the plantocracy on the sugar island of Barbados. Most members of the family didn't remain on the island. The climate was too hostile for that. And after some time on the island, most members of the family returned to England, normally to London. Yet the epitaph on the right to Robert's son, also called Robert, was a reminder that even people born on the island, like Robert Leigard Jr., wished to retain a connection with the East Riding, and specifically in Kirkella Church, just on the outskirts of the city of Hull. They reveal that despite a sojourn in Barbados, the ties to East Yorkshire remain strong. Yet rather than acknowledging the source of the family's wealth, slavery and slave owning, such memorials conveniently mask the ties to slavery, as you can see in the descriptor on the right, and instead celebrate the accomplishments of these Britons abroad as colonisers rather than slave owners. It was not just a single plantation owner who connected the region with the proceeds of slave-derived wealth. Sir Jonathan Atkins, who hailed from a place called Henderskelf in Rydale, a village situated on the site of Vanbragh's modern castle, however, built in the 17th centuries, which was funded largely through Barbadian slavery wealth. The site was a vital link for Atkins to enter into the service of the Earls of Carlisle. And through a combination of military service elsewhere and then governorship of numerous locations, he was appointed governor of Barbados at a crucial stage in its history and development between 1674 and 1680. After an infamous 1675 hurricane that devastated the island and especially her sugar crop, he not only restored the productivity, as it was described, of the island, but also, as many historians have observed, advised the king, Charles II, that enslaved Africans were more productive in the rebuilding of the island's fortunes than white labourer. So to reiterate, it was his advice which led to the increased recognition enslaved Africans were vital to the fortunes of Britain's sugar islands in the Caribbean. As the scholar A.P. Thornton noted many years ago, it was clear then that the local supply of white labour was failing. It should still be imported from England, the English and Scottish jails, but that was an expensive process. Experience, he says, has taught the sugar planters that there was a better substitute to hand in the labour of African Negroes, his quotes, who could comparatively be easily exported to the plantations from Guinea by shippers whose notion of a fair profit, although inflated, was still less grandiose than that of English merchants, magistrates, prison governors, and turnkeys. A governor of Barbados, Sir Jonathan Atkins, he says, who was often the mouthpiece of the planters' opinions, bore true witness when he commented in 1676 that, quote, 3 blacks work better and cheaper than 1 white man. It was now a truism, he goes on to say, that on the continuance of the Guinea trade, the future prosperity of all the subtropical plantations in America depended. English venturers, he says, who would have originally gone to Africa to trade in African produce, especially ivory and gold, stayed increasingly to trade in Africans themselves. Imagine that, a guy from East Yorkshire, pivotal in this moment in world history. Further, as Richard Dunn has observed, Atkins' time on the island provided not only the remote British monarchy, and crucially the Royal African Company Trevor's mentioned, with an important insight into the nature of slavery in the post-Restoration monarchy era, but also provided valuable evidence that historians can use. Dunn quotes, On April 1st, 1680, Sir Jonathan Atkins, governor of Barbados, sent a box full of statistical data about his island to the Plantation Office at Whitehall, London. This mass of data, filed among the Colonial Office papers, constitutes the most comprehensive surviving census of any English colony in the 17th century. Indeed, it's a richer store of information than any North American census before the 1770s. Atkins' administrative capabilities, as well as his military background, therefore, enabled Charles II to make the astute judgment that the future of the fortunes of the Royal African Company and Britain more generally, in the Caribbean region at least, depended on the greater use of enslaved African labour. Slavery enabled Atkins to climb progressively up the Jacobean societal ladder, marrying a relative of the Earls of Carlisle, so going from peasanthood up to earldom level, inheriting the impressive Nairworth Castle in Cumbria, still beautiful today and no doubt augmented by slave-derived wealth, and estates in East Yorkshire, which of course are what I've been interested in here. The centrality of Barbados to the family story and its elevation is even noted in a memorial of the remote estate church of Great Givendale in East Yorkshire, where in 1703 his Barbadian-born son was buried and remembered. His son, a fellow planter and Barbadian, was noted as key in his religiosity and piety. Crucially, though, as you can see from this descriptor, it elided his enslavement of Africans and his father's involvement in changing the fortunes of Africans exported forcibly from the continent abroad. Crucially, though, it wasn't increasingly people from our locality, as Trevor's already mentioned, did not venture to the Caribbean nor trade directly with the region. As the Hull History Centre identified during last year's Black Lives Matter debates, people from the region increasingly played a small but remote role in Britain's slavery economy, a trend that most of the remainder of our presentation focuses upon. The History Centre mentioned, through documents they hold in Hull, wealthy landowners such as the Constable Maxwell family from Everingham, East Yorkshire, invested in slavery enterprises. They were not going to mirror the Leagards or the Atkins. Instead, they would invest in companies such as the South Seas Company, rather than exposing themselves to the risks of the hostile climate and pestilence of the Caribbean. Crucially, few people from Hull or its hinterland centred their slave trading operations in Hull. Hull was not one of those forgotten ports which have been recently garnering attention in the media. The slave voyages database that Trevor's alluded to already notes just 2 slaving voyages originating in Hull. Note there, we're not quite sure how Trevor and I got different results, but anyway, look for yourselves. One of them sailed in 1734, called the Gore Valley, and the second went to St. Kitts in 1773, called the Fletcher. Whilst Hull was immortalised in the fictive character of Robinson Crusoe, who embarked on his own slaving voyage from Hull in Swift's famous literary account. Actually, the port played little direct involvement in slave trading. Hull's involvement, as Trevor's already mentioned, was largely through indirect support, a subject that's received less scholarly attention than the organisation of voyages, investment in slavery enterprises, or the remittance of the proceeds of slavery or abolition in British commerce. So the port town of Kingston upon Hull grew far from the statistical figures Trevor mentioned earlier at the height of slave trading and of slavery in the late 1780s. It expanded exponentially. It was not the county town that honour befell to Beverley, the place where those slave traders Trevor's just mentioned. Yet it eclipsed its administrative neighbour because of Hull's growing and expanding maritime significance. Its victualling or supplies for the slave trade included rope, weapons, maritime instruments, victuals, and mariners for the largest slaving enterprises. Such ancillary role is best exemplified through the Blade shipyard, which launched the Bethia in 1784 and which was later renamed the Bounty. As all Hull residents and visitors are reminded on a constant basis, she was part of our island's maritime story and a heroic part of our city's past. Yet the need for the voyage is often overlooked, and this was something indeed myself that I was quite negligent of until Trevor re-educated me earlier this year. The Bounty was originally setting sail to bring breadfruit, shown on the right, as a cheap source of food for the enslaved population of the Caribbean. So ignoring Captain Bligh, ignoring Fletcher Christian, the actual purpose of the voyage was for the Navy to help slavery in the Caribbean by providing a cheaper form of food to feed enslaved Africans and those living on plantations in the Caribbean. Further along Hull's High Street, what is now Georgian Houses Museum was built on the proceeds of slave-produced tar in colonial-era Charleston. Thankfully, the museums acknowledged this in 2009, and they noted that before American independence from Britain in 1783, Hull helped waterproof merchantman vessels and naval vessels through the use of tar sourced in colonial-era America. So whilst anti-slavery scholars have noted Wilberforce's conversion and role as political leader of the campaign to abolish Britain's slave trade, his birthplace was undergoing significant transformation economically, socially, and politically. During the height of Britain's slave trade and later of slavery, our involvement grew because of the changing physical fabric of the port. The opening of the largest enclosed dock in England, called the Dock in 1778, to most Hull people, the Queen's Dock, now Queen's Gardens. It made it possible for the economy of Hull to increasingly be linked to slavery and indirect slave trading. Despite claims by maritime historian Gordon Jackson that Hull faced the wrong way to be involved in slavery, up to 5% of trade in Hull came from the British West Indies, on top of the sizable trade with America. And herein lies a significant paradox for people in Hull. Why, at the very same time as Hull voters and their MP championed anti-slavery, could people in the port actively be involved in the indirect slavery-derived commerce? It's a question, I guess, for all of us to think about. The largest enclosed dock in England, therefore, became a vital cog connecting commerce with towns inland, further inland from Hull, such as Leeds, Bradford, Nottingham and Birmingham, with Atlantic commerce overseas. Connected through a series of riparian transport links from Hull, especially the Trent and Mersey Canal that opened in 1777, and then the Leeds-Liverpool Canal from 1816 onwards. The growth of Hull into the third port of England was in part enabled by the handling of slave-grown products. After the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, but crucially after the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, these links with slavery grew rather than diminished. This further paradox was not unique to Hull either. Fellow transpennine towns of Leeds, Bradford, Huddersfield and Manchester were further tarnished by greater links to slavery after Britain had abolished her slave trade in 1807. Even after Britain abolished her slavery in 1833, effective from 1838, links to slavery-derived wealth in the Americas grew until 1865. Slavery staples that arrived in Hull, including cotton and tobacco, were imported, exported and transshipped through Hull. According to some early analysis some time ago by Joyce Bellamy, trade in tobacco doubled in Hull between 1790 and 1792, from 500 and so pounds to over £1,000 a year. She asserted that rather than processing the tobacco, Hull merchants merely retailed tobacco. But if this is the case, then Hull must have grown to be the centre of tobacco retailing nationally, because the surviving evidence of the infrastructure developed exclusively for the handling of just one slave staple, tobacco, was significant. Multiple factories produced tobacco. At least 4 3-storey tobacco warehouses were in operation at any one time, and it's likely that Hull was a key transshipment port for tobacco arriving in London and then re-exported through coastal traffic to Hull. From Hull, it was transported to the hinterland, industrial economies of the Transpennines, as well as further North Sea ports, and also overseas to Hamburg, Rotterdam, and St. Petersburg. Yet this ancillary trade in tobacco was also developing. Clay pipe production in Hull also grew because of the links with the import of tobacco, and thus a network of supply chains were involved with the importation and handling of slave-grown staples far beyond the quayside. And for those who know your Hull, just to show you on here, this is one of the tobacco warehouses here, just next to the entrance to the Old Queen's Dock. And the location is just over here near the Wilberforce statue, which we'll comment on in a few minutes. Another slave staple that was imported through Hull was timber. And unlike tobacco, it was far more valuable and of far greater importance to the port's business opportunity and expanding business community. In the opening decade of the 19th century, some 300 members of the merchant community, or 8% of merchants, specialised in wood. HM Customs officials at the time noted, quote, "We apprehend more than half the vessels that arrive from any foreign ports that import solely timber." Over 13% of the UK's timber was landed at Hull in 1790 for just 1 year for which data is available. And of these 25 timber merchants, trade directories show that a number increasingly specialised in one timber in particular that came from the Caribbean, mahogany. The timber trade's home was not the river or the or remote entrepot of Hull, but instead its commercial heart, the dock that Wilberforce had campaigned for Hull to gain, and which was the centre of commerce. And whilst Baltic timber occupied the entire northern stretch of the dock, the mahogany trades were located close to the site of the Warren today, and then south to the area near Quay Street today. So significant was the trade that the mid-19th century maps of the area note Hull's mahogany yard was labelled on contemporary maps. And whilst Baltic timber was used to build merchantmen like the Bounty, the valuable trade in mahogany that was felled and laden using slave labour in two places, Saint-Domingue and Spanish Honduras, or modern-day Haiti and modern-day Belize, provided a great constant supply of this trade. As with the tobacco trade, a network of ancillary individuals who specialised in handling the wood developed too. And here they mahogany provided employment for many people. And you can see here, just to give you an idea of where the actual trade is, if you know your Hull, on the north, that's the Baltic timber trade that Trevor mentioned earlier. And then the mahogany yard was just near here, near Quay Street. On the example here is a clock manufactured in Scale Lane in Hull in 1785 of mahogany in Hull, and no doubt sourced from either Saint-Domingue or Spanish Honduras. Okay. So clock making, as well as other furniture trades, grew in the town during the Georgian era, and it all centred on the supply and constant availability of the expensive wood mahogany that arrived in Hull to sustain it. Other trades at nearby Hull, Beverley and Bridlington also depended on the mahogany arriving through Hull. And it's even possible that Thomas Chippendale, the furniture maker initially based in Leeds, also sourced some of his mahogany in his beginning of his career through Hull too. Meanwhile, maritime instrument makers, a trade often specialised here in Hull, often used only the finest mahogany to encase equipment produced locally for mariners going abroad. The sinews of slave-derived wood, therefore, permeated the finest of Georgian homes in Hull, and now can be seen in every heritage site across the city, the county, and even the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. This trade in expensive woods was profitable, and surviving wood records from the mid-century note one of the merchants' companies, Barkwood and Spalding, had between £40,000 and £50,000 in capital in 1847. Meanwhile, R&J Harrison had over £130,000 in capital exclusive of the fleet of vessels he co-owned with his partners in 1851. The proceeds of this wealth, particularly for Barkworth, are visible in the Ferrens Art Gallery, where their family portraits hang today. Meanwhile, the Barkworth's former property may be known to many of you as Hessel High School in the west of the city. This later commercial connections to the Caribbean enabled Hull merchants to secure properties and social advancement around the city of Hull. No longer did a Hull gent seek a city residence. Instead, he sought a country residence, enabled by the proceeds of wealth derived through handling slave-derived staples. Those of lesser rank, maybe agents and things, meanwhile lived a self-made existence in new Georgian esplanades to the north of Queen's Dock, shown here, in George Street, Charlotte Street, and if you were really wealthy enough, in Albion Street, Baker Street, Wright Street, Sykes Street, and Jarrett Street. Such fine estates, you may wonder, why did they develop? Well, they were all developed by one man, merchant Richard Baker, who was a tobacco merchant and who traded almost extensively with tobacco from America before and after independence from Britain. Therefore, the properties were developed by a tobacco merchant, occupied by people trading in wood and other slave-grown staples. So we can see how some of the finest architecture in Hull has slavery connections. International affairs, especially wartime taxation introduced by the UK government during the Napoleonic Wars, furthered these trades with the Caribbean, as imports from Europe were hindered and opportunities with colonial markets were encouraged. And yet this trade with the Caribbean continued once wartime measures with Europe ended. And of the 25 to 34 timber merchants, those who specialised in mahogany included Ward and Oliver, and they exclusively handled mahogany. Ward didn't just trade in timber, he represented other merchants too, in arguing for a reduction of dock duties and better facilities at the ports. His argument was strengthened and the significance of timber generally grew, as by 1843, 1/5 of all freight handled by Hull was to do with timber. Yet of course, as Trevor mentioned earlier, Hull also had a cotton trade. It was very insignificant and very small, certainly statistically very insignificant compared to Cottonopolis, Manchester, as Trevor's just mentioned. Yet whilst the trade in sugar, tobacco and trade were important, it was the American cotton that became central to the diversification of the town's economy after the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815. To give you some figures, in 1814, 7.3 million pounds of cotton twist, 54% of the UK's export trade in this commodity went through Hull. This grew to some 57.3 million pounds in 1835, and 69% of the UK's trade in this cotton product. Around 2/3 of this came through Hull because of its geographic connections. The close shipping routes or established shipping routes to Russia, Germany and the Netherlands, just 3 countries occupied 2/3 of that trade. And whilst Hull was a latecomer to the cotton manufacture business, it quickly began to dominate manufacturing in the city. The first cotton factory was founded by Manchester merchants John Ryland of Manchester in 1836, and it quickly became the largest manufacturing business in the town. In 1838, Parliament notes that the Hull cotton and flax mill offered employment to 339 people, or 140 men and 199 women and girls. Whilst this did not sound enormous, it presented a sizable growth in a different employment sector, especially for women and girls whose work or employment opportunities had previously been service. Employment in this sector continued to grow at the same time as Hull's existing trade in whaling declined, and thus the economic significance of cotton to Hull's future was essential in the 1840s. By 1840, employment in this commodity had grown to between 800 and 900 people, largely people not from Hull, but those drawn from other cotton-producing towns across the Pennines. Yet after the opening of the Kingston cotton mill, which you can see on the screen above, in 1848, a further 1,000 people were employed in this sector. By 1851, the census, 1,730 people were listed as working in cotton or related flax production. And this was seen by many scholars as an underestimate. The precarious nature, though, of the business forced the closure of many early successful companies, including a third one whose name escapes me. The first company demised in the 1850s, and the Kingston cotton mill, though, closed in the 1860s, not because of a particular decision, but because the American Civil War had halted the availability of cotton. Whilst with the end of the Civil War and the end of slavery in America, cotton supplies once again grew. Cotton manufacture kept struggling on, and eventually it closed in 1894. Yet the financial significance of this enormous cotton factory, you can see here, this is a two-story property. So just see how enormous that is, covering a vast area of site on the Wincoln Lee area. It was significantly important to Hull as an expanding manufacturing area. In 1850, half of Hull's export trade was by cotton and just one further by wool. The sector eclipsed any other employment market for most of the 19th century. That's a big claim. It was more important than shipbuilding, than whaling, than paint manufacturing or seed processing that have dominated the scholarship. And only domestic service and dressmaking employed more people in the 1841 and 1851 census. Why, therefore, has this memory of this work been expunged from our collective memory and the history books, the local history books, which have been written, especially those by leading scholars and academically trained people? If we want to appraise the significance of the mill to the town, the following summary of a report from 1861 explained what happened when that closed. Sorry, 1864. It says, and I quote here, "As to the past condition of our work people after the breaking out of the American War of Independence in the beginning of the year 1861, which has had such an unfortunate effect upon the cotton trade of the country generally, the new Hull Flax and Cotton Mill Company continued to find full employment to their usual complement of hand, averaging at 1,200 people until the 1st of October 1861, when in consequence of the unsettled state of trade, but caused by the continuous advance of the price of cotton, it was found necessary to curtail the time of working to about 5 days a week, by which rate of employment was maintained until July 1862. When it was further reduced to 4.5 days a week until the 7th of August 1862, and from that date until the end of 1863, when the mills were closed, the average time worked would have been half that time. The cotton famine, often discussed about Manchester and the Trans-Pennine towns, hit Hull. It caused a huge economic and social burden in an era when unemployment benefit wasn't available. Whilst many scholars have debated Zachariah Pearson of Hull's demise because of a default of loan linked with the Civil War, few have mentioned the Kingston cotton mill. Another person also involved in the Pearson bankruptcy was the shipbuilder Martin Samuelson, who owed creditors £25,000 when the Pearson bankruptcy occurred. Samuelson, a shipbuilder and self-made man, whose yard on the site of the deep, shown in the screen, worked with the Confederate Army and the Confederate Navy to construct blockade runners. You can see here the vessels on the left. Indeed, the self-made man was so boastful that he noted in this illustrated news drawing of the time, how the largest number of vessels launched in British history took place at Hull at the same time. Yet despite these adverts, few people mention Many of these vessels were blockade runners supporting the American South. Despite his assertions that he and Pearson were not involved in supporting the Confederate cause, aspects of Samuelson's past further ascertain why he was involved in supporting the American South. He was the son of a Liverpool tobacco importer, the grandson of the trader from Confederate HQ in Richmond, Virginia. He invested in, constructed vessels for, and inherited the proceeds of shipping slave-grown products from America. Though he launched more ships on any single day than any yard in British maritime history, all coincided to time with the American Civil War. Unlike Pearson's involvement with the Confederate cause, this aspect was never discussed, and Sammy's Point, as it's affectionately known, was a key part of Hull's social memory. Yet unlike Pearson, whose descendants have written a book to try and defend and exonerate their ancestor, nobody has so far stood up to support the work of Samuelson. Tonight, it's been impossible to detail every link we've found to Hull's slavery past, nor to trace the link of the proceeds of slave-derived wealth. Yet from the cannon on Nelsonian-era vessels that protected the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean during times of war, to the use of enslaved labour rather than indentured labourers, people from Hull and its hinterland played an economic role in the slave trading, and the Caribbean. Whilst such pro-slavery interests are airbrushed from the city's history, I hope that these examples show why Black Lives Matter do concern us, rather than just other places like Bristol. To conclude for both myself and Trevor, the city of Kingston upon Hull in the past and the present had a Janus-faced relationship with slavery. Whilst we are right to acknowledge the anti-slavery work in the town was unrivaled for its size and undiminished zeal, including contemporary debates about forms of slavery today, we must question the silences in our civic story too. As historian Kate Donnington has demonstrated, other areas of the city, even the Clapham Church in London, which was associated with anti-slavery heroes like Clarkson and Wilberforce, they had an anti-slavery past and a pro-slavery past, with the slaving congregants worshipping alongside their more famous anti-slavery counterparts. As evidence presented in this webinar by Trevor and myself highlights, the city, surrounding county of East Riding of Yorkshire, people and communities, churches and even shipyards are all implicated in this slave era story. Rather than removing statues to slave trader though, Hull is in the months ahead set to expand its heritage, which has links to Hull's slavery past, through the erection of a new purposely commissioned weather vane of the Bounty, shown on the right hand side, above her civic headquarters, the Guildhall. This year's festival, Freedom Festival installation, the Hull Vigil, is also located conveniently for us tonight above the Hull College. And if you're engaging with this, please reflect on who we are. Please note that the statue, as we've shown already, is close to the statue of the location is close to the statue of William Wilberforce, who, according to the label on his statue, ended Negro slavery, to quote. But we would also ask you to reflect upon the pro-slavery story of who we are and where we are. For the location of the Hull Vigil is especially poignant tonight because, as we've shown, it was next to the city's largest tobacco warehouse, which was ironically located a stone's throw from this later shrine to anti-slavery, the statue of William Wilberforce. But enough of us, of both of us, we now welcome your ideas on what we've discussed tonight, and especially how we can advance what we've discovered and how we can share the findings with other people. If you've enjoyed what we're saying tonight, I'll just mention this now in case I forget. We've got some other events taking place in a few weeks. So we've got the Windrush Day event on the 22nd of June, and then appropriately a conference to do with the anniversary of the publication of Richard Dunn's Sugar and Slaves. So if you are interested, please get in touch, but we'll now hand it over to questions from you. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll just got to do this 1 second. Okay, so a question from Andrew Barnes. He said, good evening and thank you for your great presentation. I'm currently researching the political culture of the East Riding County Council from the late 19th centuries to 1973. Early indications show that the ruling elite of the East Riding retained control of the East Riding Council until at least the mid-20th century, with a sculpture of squirearchy and deference throughout this time. Hull appears politically separate, developing a much more liberal and radical early culture in the early 19th century. It's my assertion that the two authorities never gelled, probably agree with that, even today. Sorry, I've lost this question now. Even today, sorry. Is it possible that the abhorrent enterprises of Denton, Taylor and Watt et al. Were more acceptable for the East Riding due to the political culture of deference which prevailed, whereas radical Hull was not afraid to question wrongdoings, unlike those in the East Riding? Yeah, that's a very good question there, very detailed. So yeah, I think I'd agree there, Andrew. It's I think for me, there's always been a very significant difference between the county of the East Riding, so in other words, the people who own the large estates Trevor mentioned, and people living in Beverley or even those living in Hull. So I don't know, it would need more work, but I think it was very much a conservative county, hence why there's a drawing of Benjamin Disraeli just in Beverley Bar near that area. So there are links, but I think certainly it's that political culture is reflected very much with that. Trevor, did you want to add anything there? Okay, we can't hear you, Trevor.
I can't add anything to that. Yes, no. I certainly don't want to get into an East Riding Hull discussion. I'll leave that to the participants from either side.
Okay, so we've got a question from Judith for Nick and Trevor. You've suggested that those involved in the slave trade did not like to advertise their involvement. Why do you think this is? What this is, and why was it such a huge part of English commerce? Trevor, do you want to answer that?
Well, I think two things. I think mostly I think that people who were involved in the slave trade, particularly places like Liverpool, Bristol, and London, had no real problem with advertising it because they were part of it. I think what we're stressing today, I mean, certainly one thing I wanted to stress was that slavery was so important within all of the aspects of British culture and certainly a British economy that it was hard to sort of escape it. But over time, it became convenient for people to forget that part. It became much easier to remember and to suggest that you were always involved in anti-slavery, and to forget the period when that was not the case. And I think that's one of the things we have. It's not so much an amnesia, I wouldn't say that, but it's a subtle rewriting of the 18th century and the early 19th century to suggest that attitudes that were held by the early 19th century in regard to slavery were not held prior to that. I guess the other thing I would say as well is that this is something which says something about our own age. We're far more sensitive now to these things than we were in the past. I remember reading a review of I'm involved in a project in Italy, which is talking about a world traveller in the 16th century, went all around the world from Florence, and he was a slave trader. Yet a review of his book by Sir John Eliot, one of our greatest British historians, in 1960, just ignored the fact of slavery, and that was very common. Is that it was something that was not highlighted very much. And even now, you can see an awful lot of things, awful lot of books and events which have slavery as being incidental to British history. I'm reading a magnificent book. It's a fantastic book on the Enlightenment. It's 900 pages. It has 2 pages on slavery. and virtually, and in that hardly mentions sort of race. So we can do those sorts of things. The emphasis I'd like to say, though, however, is that, and this is certainly someone as an historian of Jamaica and of the West Indies, is that the plantation economies were so large within British life that it was hard to ignore them. What did happen with Britain, of course, is that Britain has always been very good at excluding those parts of Britain which somehow don't fit into what the conception of Britain might be. What we might call, might say John Pocock, a New Zealand historian, one of my mentors, called the Ulsterisation of British history. We see that with Northern Ireland. We see it today with Northern Ireland, and we see it with the West Indies. We see it with the Americas. It's a characteristic form of British political life, which is to exclude people from being thought of as British if suddenly they demonstrate various things that seem to be not very British. And by the early 19th century, the majority of Britain, including Hull, not only considered slavery wrong, but considered themselves to be an anti-slavery nation. And so it became very easy then to try and forget what they'd done in the past. But I would suggest also that we shouldn't condemn people too much for that, because I think if we looked at our own lives, we will see that we changed our views from what we change our views now about what we did 30, 40 years ago. If we're that old, or if you're a cricketer from what you did 8 years ago, these sorts of things are difficult. And I think that is one of those big historical questions is in terms of memory. What part of your past do you recognise and what don't you recognise? Anyway, that was rambling a little bit. But Nick, did you have some things to say on that?
Well, I would have just said, I think you're right specifically, and obviously I'll defer to your national expertise on that one. But I think locally, Judith, one of the issues, as John Oldfield has discussed in his Call to Freedom, is that there's an increasing or an almost immediate culture within Hull to venerate the memory of Wilberforce, and there was this perception. And I think here there was an idea that if we've ended slavery within the colonies, that's our own trade, that's one thing. Trading with a foreign country like America is a different one. And so it's interesting, I think, that the zenith of cotton imports took place in the 1850s, and the second statue to Wilberforce was unveiled in 1858 at the anniversary of Wilberforce's death. So you can see how the memorialization of a saint like Wilberforce, as he was seen by many, coincided with this trade as well. And so I think it's very much that they just felt Wilberforce's campaign had been finished and their work was very different. And I think the historians writing subsequently believed Reginald Coupland, believed the Wilberforce brothers, believed Clarkson's account of the abolition of slavery, and in a way they ignored this American trade. And I guess the question's always been in my mind, why? Why would the descendant of Zachariah Pearson write a book that defended it? Why would the council, when Pearson's Park was reopened last year, have a almost state event for it, venerating Pearson unquestionably, even though Pearson's links with the Confederate cause had been highlighted? It's quite interesting what people and communities do. So I think that's quite interesting. But anyway, a good question, Judith. I think we can debate that many a time. Anyway. Another question's coming from Abigail Burnard. She said, have any letters that have survived from that period or from discussing those links? From my point, Abigail, there are not letters, but they are legal documents held at the Treasure House in Beverley to do with the families that I mentioned, and you can get the names of the enslaved people they owned at the time. So I think I'd have a look at that. There are also some letters to do with people during the period of anti-slavery, so in the 1780s and 90s locally. Indeed, I always remember South Cave, where the Burnards of South Cave, the owners, were in favour of slave trading, and yet their cleric, who they appointed and gave the living to at the church in South Cave, was opposed to it. And so there's a juxtaposition even with a small place like South Cave. But Trevor, did you want to comment on the letters that have survived from this period discussing these links, or discussing enslavement more generally?
Well, the one thing I would say is that it may not be Hull or East Riding, but certainly the work of Thomas Thistlewood, who's from Lincolnshire, and certainly if you take the TV program, Look North, and see Lincolnshire as part of our region, that you have from that the most complete set of letters by anybody from this particular region, if we consider Lincolnshire as connected to the East Riding and to York, the most complete record of anyone's life among enslaved people, and it's a pretty horrific account in many ways. I suspect one of the things that I think would be interesting is that I do suspect there's a lot more material in families in various ways out there, and I guess this relates to one of the things that we said beforehand from Judith's question. One of the things that I hope we're doing as a people, as a nation, and people in terms of history, is a much more open and accepting view of what people were like in the past, particularly our own ancestors. I think there's been any number of people. I think there's a brand new book out by Alex Renton on his family in the Fergusons in Scotland. A number of these types of books which have come out, which deal with people's families and in relationship to the past. And I think it's in some ways is that we don't need to be, we want to be honest about what our ancestors did in the past. It doesn't really help anyone, I think, to see our ancestors as being perfect or being any different from people of their age. And I think there's one thing that Nick and I would say is that what we're trying to do is to say that the involvement with all the things with slavery was not something exceptional, or even something which was would cast a person out into being disliked or being disregarded. It was so central to the global processes of which Hull, as a global city, was involved in. That gets a long way away from the fact that I don't know what letters there are, but I suspect there's a lot more out there than we think.
And if you find any, get in touch, because we'd be interested. Yeah. Okay. So another question's come in from Alan White. He says, if the slavery connections to Hull are indirect, did this affect Hull's influence on Wilberforce's political beliefs? And secondly, would Wilberforce have had to leave Hull to become the abolitionist he became? Some very good questions there, Alan. I think regarding the first one, which I'll probably answer, I guess Wilberforce was more disconnected from Hull than actually we remember. He went obviously to school in Wimbledon as a boy before coming back, went to Pocklington, near that great Givendale that I mentioned as a school boy, and then went to uni and never really came back. So I guess whilst Hull had a clear connection to Wilberforce and Wilberforce to Hull, I think his connections with the city were not as strong as we would have expected. So there would probably be a disconnect there. Certainly his cousins were involved in the sugar mill in Hull, which Trevor mentioned earlier. So there are some connections. On the second point, Trevor, did you have anything to say about would Wilberforce have had to leave Hull to become the abolitionist it became, do you think?
Well, I guess one of the things you would say about it is that Hull suited Wilberforce, bearing in mind all that Nick says, and bearing in mind the things that we've said about Hull as having connections with slavery. We need to keep that in balance. The connections that Hull had with slavery were far less than other parts of the country. So that certainly if Wilberforce had been in Liverpool or Bristol or many other places, it might have been a bit more difficult for him to be an abolitionist. But as Nick pointed out, Wilberforce spent a great deal of his life in London. He spent a great deal of his life among people who would have been pro-slavers. He had a choice before he became an evangelical. He talks very much about his gay life, his way that he enjoyed all sorts of things. You could see very easily if things had gone a different way, that he could have been enjoying the company of pro-slavers. And so that's why I think that it's important really to recognize just what Wilberforce did do, because being an abolitionist in the 1780s in particular, but all the way through, was not an easy road to hold. He would have had a large number of people in Hull who would not have supported what he said. He would have had even more people in London who would not have supported what he did. And certainly he faced levels of abuse which would put the type of abuse that we put on politicians today in the shade. I mean, we could have done a whole lecture. We could do a lecture on cartoonists saying horrible things about Wilberforce. So you don't want to diminish his achievement, but Hull, I wouldn't want to diminish his achievement as being part of Hull as well, because Hull was a place which was even with the slavery links, did have strong links to anti-slavery, some of which were built up by Wilberforce, but some of which came independent from him.
And I think building on from Trevor's point there, it's worth noting that aside from Wilberforce, although no doubt influenced by him, Hull had the greatest amount of support by number and by value for the creation of Sierra Leone as a post-slave free society than any other place outside London. And that's pretty enormous. 10% of the money came from our region, and that included men as well as women. And so that's pretty important to remember. This support for abolitionism, this zeal, was pretty strong, pretty entrenched. And so it's very important to acknowledge that, although we mentioned slavery tonight, we're not undermining the anti-slavery venom either, support for it. Okay. Next question is coming from Hannah Betts. So good evening, Hannah. She's put, thank you so much for a fantastic session. I'm a history teacher at Hull Collegiate College, or school, sorry, and I'm looking to develop a scheme of work relating to the Wilson family. Do you happen to know if the shipping company had any links to slavery or traded in slave-produced goods? So yeah, thank you for a good question there, Hannah. I did my PhD, as Sylvia alluded to earlier, on the Wilson family's involvement in shipping people. They did have the dominance in iron and the best type of Swedish iron, although it was from the much later period that they were involved with. However, I'm suggesting, and this is where I'd have to do more work, they did bring in cotton from India after the Suez Canal opened in the 1860s. So I think there will be some connection there, and that's where it was exploitative labour rather than slave-derived goods. So they're probably a bit later for this question, but it's the latest stuff. But drop me an email and I'll check that out for you. Okay. So the next question came again from Alan. So good questions here tonight, Alan. So the figures shown for Bishop Burton suggest that there was a lot of slaves owned by one person. He asks, do you know whether the figures for domestic servants, what the figures were, sorry, for domestic servants in middle-class households? Did a lot of people own one or two slaves? And was this quite a big contrast from the numbers presented in the Bishop Burton data? So did you want to answer that, Trevor?
Yeah, very quickly. I think that one of the things that people have been concentrating, particularly on the legacies of British slaveholding, is about slaveholdings of people who lived in Britain. And the people who lived in Britain tended to be among the biggest slaveholders. So that, for example, I mentioned the three people I mentioned with 1,000 slaves, 737 slaves, and Richard Watt with 296 enslaved people. They're all very large slaveholders. The majority of slave owners owned relatively small numbers of enslaved people. So most enslaved people were owned by the few people who owned large amounts of enslaved people, but most slave owners only had a few enslaved people. And the one part of the legacies of British slaveholding that is yet to really be explored is the large number of people in the Caribbean who owned slaves, because probably 60% of slave owners, but only about 30 odd percent, and I can't remember the exact title, but it's under 40%, only 30 to 40% of enslaved people were in the Caribbean. But slave owning was pretty widespread among the white and brown populations of those areas. And a large percentage of those enslaved people would have been not in sugar, but they would have been domestic servants or employed in other sorts of ways. for people like Richard Watt, there were figures, I can't remember exactly what they are, I've got them in the notes somewhere, but the majority of his enslaved population were field hands. Quite a considerable percentage were denoted as weak or ill, and he had a relatively large number of domestic slaves among those 296 enslaved people.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a question from Martin Taylor at the History Centre. So good evening, Martin. He's asked, while we are proud of Wilberforce and Hartley's records as MP for Hull, Wilberforce was MP for Hull for only a short period of time, and Hartley lost 2 elections. Has any work been done on other Hull MPs which may reveal a more nuanced political attitude from the city? I think it's a really poignant question there, Martin. I'll let Trevor answer that in a second, but from what knowledge I've got, I'd say yes, it is more nuanced. Certainly, Rob Robinson in his work on Hull's global links highlighted anti-slavery, but he didn't highlight pro-slavery interests. So I think that's something where this celebratory history, you know, we need to engage with it more critically. I think what's important there, Martin, is 2 things. One, I've not yet looked at how people voted for Wilberforce. A previous student did that, but I didn't check the other day based on the links I mentioned tonight about trading in indirect goods and whether that influenced their voting or anything, behaviour. And secondly, at council level rather than MP level, clearly Samuelson was a councillor who I mentioned earlier, along with Zachariah Pearson. So there were clearly a lot more complex situations at local level and not necessarily MP level. Another MP I know of, whose name escapes me at the minute, but lived in South Yorkshire but represented Hull in the 1790s. He was a supporter of the Sierra Leone project, so I presume he was anti-slavery as well. So there's a huge mismatch of things, and certainly the people of Hull, even in the Yorkshire elections, which Wilberforce held the seat for from 1784 to 1812, don't show everybody in Hull supported Wilberforce. So I think that's quite important. But did you add anything to add to that, Trevor?
No, I don't know the specifics of it. I guess one thing is, as far as I'm aware, there was no significant pro-slavery interest in Hull. There might have been a bit more in the East Riding. I think there's a very good book by Michael Taylor called The Interest, and I remember he talks about that there was in this particular area some pro-slavery support, but I don't know what it was. But I don't think it was ever manifested in politics. But it would be a good subject, I think, for a student to do, which would be to look at the voting records of MPs in the larger region and to see to what extent they were pro-slavery or anti-slavery. So I doubt that would change the general opinion of Hull as a mostly anti-slavery town, but they're probably, given that the country had a large number of people who were tended towards pro-slavery, be very surprising if there weren't people like that here.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And certainly I forgot there to mention that, of course, people did vote for Lascelles, you know, as well as Wilberforce in the 1807 elections. I think that's quite interesting there as well in terms of slaving interest. But anyway, we've got another question. Thank you, Martin. Anyway, so another question from Charlotte Petty. Good evening, Charlotte. She's asked how much is recorded, or are there any records of men from Hull who worked on ships carrying goods to the Caribbean? So I guess the easier question, Charlotte, is I'm not sure. Martin Taylor can probably answer more than anyone, but I'll hand over to the Caribbean expert, Trevor. Did you have anything further to add on that?
Don't know at all.
That we'll get back to Charlotte. Certainly, Charlotte, for the captains, we can.
My understanding is I've not found. Maybe there are, but I've certainly not found any ship captains from Hull.
Yeah.
If they were, it's 1 or 2 people, and I don't think there's any that I've found. So.
Yeah, they were clearly from out of town, like Bridlington. So, anyway, I'm only joking there, Bridlington. You've got enough with your clock industry to worry about. Okay, so a question from Andrew Smith. Do you have any thoughts on how modern mainstream attitude to historical slavery compares to the public's views on modern slavery, with a particular emphasis on the suffering of what we call today victims, and how we compare the perceived benefits to the traders and the economy in history, and the benefits to criminals and the economy today? So Trevor, did you want to handle that one?
Oh, thanks. Because that's a great question, but a very difficult one. One of the things I kept on emphasizing in my talk was to say that I think that it's a bad move or to look back on the past, to condemn people in the past for various things without looking at what we do ourselves. I don't think that our attitudes would stand up to much scrutiny as well, and you know this as well as anyone, Andrew, in terms of modern slavery. What we do know about modern slavery is that it's linked to all sorts of things, some of which we know about, some of which we pretend not to care about, and others of which we are probably ignorant about. And I think that's probably the case in the 18th century as well. I mean, I mentioned that things like copper, things like iron, things like woolen, things like timber would be involved in the in supporting slavery and the slave system. I'd be very surprised if many people at the time would be aware, or really perhaps care about those certain things. And in that way, it's probably very similar to the ways in which we can conveniently close our eyes to various aspects of modern slavery as well.
And why I referred to Trevor on that one was not to put him on the spot with a very good question, Andrew, although he'll probably hit me later for it. I'm only joking. I think the point Trevor was making earlier today to somebody was about, you know, that if you think of the contemporary links through Indirect, slavery links to, you know, mobile phone links to contemporary slavery and other things today, I guess it's that issue of how many goods we consume that may have a link, and whether that affects our consumer behaviour or not. I guess another answer to your question is that at the time, as Trevor mentioned earlier, it seems perfectly acceptable, slavery and slave trading, and it wasn't therefore a criminal issue. So I guess it's very much, you know, how that relates to everything today. So I guess the comparator would be, Andrew, based on your work, would be whether people avoid car washes because they know it's involved with slavery or not, or could be. Did they avoid slave staples in the past or not? It could be that through personal choice they want to buy them, even though publicly they support anti-slavery or whatever. So hopefully that makes sense. Although I realise it's
one thing I just add to this. I think which one reason why it's very important to study abolitionism and anti-slavery, and our former director John Oldfield makes this very clear in his books, is that one of the reasons to do so is that so much of how we would conceive of politics today comes absolutely from abolitionist activity. So any of the things that we're doing in campaigning about modern slavery, about all sorts of things, about climate change, there's a very direct link to the type of politics that were put forward in the 1780s. And these were very new at that stage. That wasn't the sort of politics. If you look at politics from the 1780s onwards after abolitionism, it's very different from a politics, say, of the 1660s or the 1580s, let alone earlier periods. And so that's one of the reasons why studying people like Wilberforce, like Thomas Clarkson, like abolitionists of all sorts, studying not just white abolitionists but black abolitionists of this period is very important, not just because it was about the subject that they were doing, but the manner of what they did was important. And think, for example, in abolitionism, it's one of the first movements where women were significant political actors, and you can't think of many things before that was the case. So I'd add that in as being important. And I think that's one of the things in the public discourse at the moment. There's a lot of public discourse about slavery, and that's right. It's very right that we talk about the links that we have to slavery in Britain. We always need to remember is that from the 1770s, particularly from the 1780s onwards, all of a sudden, slave owners didn't get their own way. They were a formidable force, but and what slavery did, as Nick has shown, was central to British economy and culture in all sorts of ways. But they were opposed by people in many ways. When we think of the cotton blockades, we need to remember that as well. And one of the things, of course, that's important, which makes it contradictory, is that we think of both Hull and Manchester as being very dependent on cotton, that's absolutely true. There are also places with large numbers of working people who are strongly committed to anti-slavery. And so you have to think of both sides in that particular way.
Okay. So again, Andrew, it's a good question. Anyway, our final comment tonight, so thank you to everybody who's made comments or asked questions and for listening. It comes from our former director, John Oldfield. He says it's a comment rather than a question, but he said Wilberforce spent little time in Hull, and for most of his political career was MP for Yorkshire rather than Hull. The city proper was not a leading centre of anti-slavery activity, and though Wilberforce's statue was erected by public subscription, it was largely a struggle to raise the necessary funds. There's an interesting book to be written on the city's relationship to and with Wilberforce, and how to some extent he was being appropriated by the city. I'd agree there, John, which is not to deny that many local people supported abolition or indeed Sierra Leone. Thanks again to John, and thanks again to everybody for your contributions. So we're going to now hand over to Sylvia as our chair this evening.
I'm not sure if you can see me, but I hope, more important, you can hear me. And I think we all feel a great debt of thankfulness to John, to Nick, and to Trevor for presenting us with an area of evidence which we know we need to know more about. The words which came to mind to me were those used in a different situation, which is lest we forget. But I think it has the same impact, that there have been so many people in past situations who suffered, and other people at the end had certain benefits. But we've got a future, and I really appreciate the comments you made, that we need to learn, but not to spend our time sort of thinking, well, they made terrible mistakes. I wouldn't have done that. Well, actually, we don't know. And I think we need to be very honest about this. I feel from the questions, I would like to thank people for the really interesting range. We've all shared in a situation which is going to help us debate further, think further, and probably make some choices, because today it's a consumer society. I'm personally feeling rather guilty about the very small price I paid for some cotton goods earlier this week. And I think, you know, we have responsibilities in that area. It's already this is a very practical point. It's already been mentioned that this session has been recorded and it's going to be available on YouTube. And I'm sure a lot of people will want to recommend this to their friends. And this is because it has been such an interesting evening. Thanks to the two of you here and to several staff at WISE who've done the technical work, without which this wouldn't have happened. So thanks to everybody. And those of us in the Historical Association hope to welcome you to sessions in the autumn, but also to further connections with WISE. Thank you all very much.